Hello, listeners, and welcome to an emergency episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. And today, Javier Milei is president of Argentina. We're recording here Monday, November 20th. I think we will probably get this thing out first thing tomorrow morning. I don't want to step on the Paul Triolo episode. If you didn't listen to that first thing Monday morning, it's an excellent episode on a topic everybody's talking about and nobody knows anything about. And Paul actually knows some of the nitty gritty. So I encourage you to listen to that episode if you haven't already. But if you're here for analysis of Argentina's elections, let's get to it. I invited Ignacio to come on the podcast to talk about this, but he didn't get back to my email in time. I'm sure that he is inundated with requests, or perhaps is just upset about the election outcome. You might remember that a couple of weeks ago, Ignacio and Elohim were on the podcast together, and we talked about Sergio Massa, the former economy minister's surprising showing in the first round of elections. And Ignacio went so far as to predict that Milei was done, that he wasn't going to be able to win in round two. And I have to tell you, when he said that so assuredly, you go back and listen to the episode if you want, a little tingle went down the back of my spine. It reminded me a little bit of Brexit. And it reminded me a little bit of Trump's victory in 2016, where everybody was thinking one thing and then results went in the opposite direction. Atlas Intel, which was the poll that really forecast the first round of elections fairly well, it had Milei in front for most of the last couple of weeks, but only by a 2 or 3 percentage point margin. And that's roughly still within the margin of error for the polls. Nobody had a poll with the shocking results with Milei. I'm reading right here, 55.69% of the vote to Sergio Massa's 44.31%. This was not a close election, even though most of the polls suggested that it was going to be so. I don't know whether that's because people were afraid to say they were going to vote for Milei. I don't know whether that's because people were voting in demographics that the pollsters weren't able to survey. But that same sort of, well, the polls said one thing, but then on election day, something else completely different happened. We hadn't really had a surprise like that happen in a couple of years, but there it is. It happened again in Argentina. The first thing I want to say is that anytime you have a peaceful transition of power in such a contentious election and where the views espoused by both sides are so diametrically different, that is something to salute. And that is something to say about everything that is happening within Argentina, inflation at 140% and poverty on the rise, and people just generally doubting the competence of their own government and the future of their own spending power. When you can have a peaceful transition of power like that, that means something good about the country and about the health of the country's democracy. So for that, I think we can say good things about Argentina in general. I know that the question that I was getting overwhelmingly in the weeks leading up to the election was, are there going to be protests? Are there going to be protesters from the Peronists if Milei wins? Are there going to be protests from Milei with chainsaws if the Peronists win? It looks to me like, and in part because of the margin of victory here, it doesn't look like there's going to be a lot of widespread unrest. Massa has already, very early on, called and conceded the election to Milei very professionally. Democracy is working in Argentina, at least for now, and that is something positive and something good to be said. We've talked about Milei here on the podcast a little bit. We will have ample opportunity to talk about him in the future. I don't want to shortchange what a strange dude this guy is. He has a lot of strange views. He felt very, very passionately about his dog Conan, paid $50,000 for the dog to be cloned after its death in 2017. He's talked about how Conan contacted him through a medium and gave him the mission to be president. He said dogs are the best strategists in the world. Well, maybe I don't disagree with that, but that is the type of personality that we're dealing with here. We are not dealing with someone, let alone who is on the old political spectrum of how things usually work in Argentina. This guy has some very strange views, and he has strange views that are really outside of the context of most normal political beliefs in Argentina. He wants laxer gun control laws. He wants tighter rules on abortion, even though he's a self-described anarchist or radical libertarian. So there are a lot of things here with Milei that don't make sense, and he himself is a source of great instability, and we'll see whether he's able to put that instability aside and rise to the occasion as a leader, or whether he's going to be prisoner to his own impulses and his own unpredictability. That volatility, I think, is more than anything else that people who are against Milei are most afraid of, that this is somebody that they don't feel like they can predict. That said, Former Argentine President Mauricio Macri supported him. Patricia Bullrich, who was the third place finisher in the first round, she supported him. After the first round, which I think played a big role in him winning in the second round of elections. When you have the center right candidate saying, "Okay, like we can't go with an official from the previous government," in Bullrich's words, they literally oversaw the worst economy in Argentina's history, which is really saying something. We have to go with change. And so, in that sense, Milei is a vote for change. And the center right in Argentina is telling you they think Milei can be a change agent, somebody that can be used to create change, but somebody who is not going to go off the deep end, or who at least can be controlled by the center right in general. There are going to be limits to just how far Milei can go in general. Again, here, if you go back to the first round of elections, so the makeup of Argentina's legislature was already decided then. So Milei's party is only going to have 39 out of roughly 257 seats in the Chamber of Deputies, and he's only going to have 8 seats out of 72 seats in the Senate. Even if you put together the center-right coalitions with those votes, that is not an overwhelming majority. So even though he gets an overwhelming majority in the second round of the presidential election, in terms of actually governing, in terms of following through on threats like dollarization or privatization of YPF, the energy company, or any of the several number of things that he's talking about, he is going to have to work with the political system in Argentina. He doesn't just get to take out the chainsaw and start cutting things off like he wants to. He is constrained in a very, very real way. Now, we saw in the last couple of weeks, Milei moderated his tone a little bit. He tried to appear a little bit more reasonable. He was just as defiant as ever in his victory speech, but in the last couple of weeks, he was a little bit softer. Maybe there is some pragmatism underneath it all, amidst all the channeling with dogs and everything else. He's going to need that pragmatism if he wants to move the ball forward at all. We have seen in Latin America, even in the last couple of years, over and over and over again, what a huge change in the ideology of the top office can mean if the legislature is not with you. We saw it in Peru. It eventually resulted in an attempted coup and then the military putting in somebody else. In Colombia, Petro is experiencing this right now. He's not able to follow through on a lot of his different reforms. Boric in Chile, in his own way, is also dealing with this. So if Milei is not able to moderate, if he's not able to work with even the center right and do that, this could get very ugly very quickly. And then a lot of different scenarios come on the table. I think, based on his behavior thus far and the fact that Macri and Bullrich and all these other voices are behind him, everybody seems to think that he can be the change agent without completely tanking everything. We'll see. That's a big bet to make. But that, I think, is the direction that we're heading in. About dollarization, I'm not an economist, and I don't exactly know how to benchmark what dollarization for an economy of Argentina's size, with inflation at the rate that it is at, with the deterioration of the value of the Argentine peso against the dollar. I mean, in the black market, it's gone to over 1,000. I don't know how you even conceptually begin to wrap your head around that. Maybe I'll have to try and get an economist on here who can think about the issues. I can tell you, though, that I think the case study to look back to is Brazil in the early 1990s. Brazil at the time was dealing with hyperinflation. Brazil had gone back and forth in inflationary cycles, really going back to the 1950s and 60s. And the way that Brazil fixed that, it didn't necessarily dollarize the economy, but it basically created a new currency out of whole cloth. And in some ways, the importance of that currency, there was nothing sort of economic or logistical about it that fixed the problem. It was about psychology. They wanted to get rid of the previous notions of the old currency, which everybody just thought was worthless and was only going to get more worthless. And once you started getting products that were priced in terms of this new currency, milk is one of these, and skateboard is two of these, or whatever it was. Eventually, psychologically, you had this transition to basically a new Brazilian currency, and they sort of start the clock over. And it took years, even decades, for the Brazilian economy to recover. Brazil now is an incredible success story, and it's a success story we talk about here a lot on the podcast, because from an investment perspective, we have liked Brazil for the last couple of years, and we've been a benefactor of some of those changes. But even in Brazil's case, it took years, decades, and there were stops and starts and different changes in governments across the spectrum. So I think if you're thinking best case scenario here for Argentina going forward, Argentina is in its early 90s Brazil moment. It's realized that it needs epic change. It's not exactly sure what the change is, but it's elected a government that at least has the mandate to try, that has the mandate to say, you know what, everything else that has been tried beforehand is not good. We have this guy at the top who's going to be pushing for the most radical solutions possible, but we have a legislature that is going to be somewhat moderating. And maybe in the compromise space between the radical and between the legislature, maybe you can start to install some policies that will unravel the mess that Argentina's economy is and help set it up for success here over the coming years. Um, about geopolitics, I want to take a step back here and just say there are a couple geopolitical, sort of explicitly geopolitical considerations to make here. The first is that Milei is not a fan of China, and previous Argentine governments have sort of been trying to have their cake and eat it too with the United States and China, have been trying to have good relations with the United States, but also having very close relations with China. Um, Argentina just paid part of an IMF loan with Chinese yuan. Milei has said some pretty strong things about China. I'll quote him here while he was a candidate. People are not free in China. They can't do what they want. And when they do it, they get killed. Would you trade with an assassin? That's literally what he has to say about China. And we have seen that China and Xi Jinping don't take very well to this kind of criticism coming from would be partners. And Argentina is definitely a would be partner for China. This is the area that China can push back against the United States. The South China Sea is to China, as you could say the Western Hemisphere is to the United States, going back to the Monroe Doctrine and your U.S. history for those of you who are U.S. listeners. So we may see a little bit of a break here in Argentina-China relations. We may see some improvement in Argentina-U.S. relations. I also think Argentina is going to have a very difficult position for itself within Latin America itself. Both Lula in Brazil and AMLO in Mexico came out and wanted nothing to do with Milei even before the election, endorsed Massa, said Massa was the logical candidate, couldn't conscious a world in which Milei was going to be president, which is very rich. They are both populists. AMLO, I wouldn't even call him a leftist populist. He, in some ways, has more in common with Milei than he might care to admit. It's kind of funny to me that these two populists couldn't see just sort of an uber version of themselves hyped up in a country where problems are that much more serious and that much more significant. That said, it really does speak to an ideological lack of affinity between Argentina and basically everybody else that's going to be around it. Now, maybe Milei can put that away. Maybe he can appoint, some more moderate figures in positions to deal with foreign policy. I get the sense that he's going to be more concerned about domestic policy than foreign policy. But I do think if you're thinking in terms of South American integration, if you're thinking in terms of Argentina-Brazil relations or Argentina-Mexico relations, all of these are challenged by the rise of a figure like Milei. Last but not least, before I end it here, Argentina has been a land of potential for a very long time. In the early 1900s, Argentina was one of the wealthiest countries in the world. The standard of living was accustomed to some of the richest countries in the world, like France at the time. And it has always been a little bit of a geopolitical riddle that Argentina, despite immense geographic resources, despite every single geopolitical advantage you could possibly want, has been a complete and total dumpster fire for over half a century. Argentina sits on the Rio de la Plata. The Rio de la Plata is basically the Mississippi River of South America. Argentina should have all the advantages that a Mississippi River complex gives to the United States, and yet it has not been able to turn that into wealth and into power. Today, Argentina is blessed with ample agricultural resources. It has ample lithium, which it's trying to take advantage of in terms of the electrical vehicle boom. Listeners who have been with me for a long time know what I think about that. But hey, people are paying for lithium right now, and Argentina has a lot of it. So joke's on me. And last but not least, Argentina is at the very beginning stages of a shale revolution of their own. We've had Chase Taylor from Pinecone Macro on the podcast a couple times. He's talked about this once or twice, and that's one of the reasons those energy stocks like YPF are jumping today, because they're thinking, oh, you're going to privatize the energy companies right now. Argentina probably is looking at a future where it doesn't have to import energy anymore. It's probably going to become a net energy exporter, and that's a big deal for Argentina in general. Last but not least, one of the reasons the last couple of years have been so challenging is that you had that triple dip La Nina and then really poor growing conditions for Argentina's harvest over the last couple of years. And that meant that Argentina's soybeans and its corn and its other big ag exports, it got a lot less revenue from them. And that meant there was a lot less capital actually in the system. And for a Peronist government under Alberto Fernandez, which, like most Argentina governments, just wanted to spend here and there. They had less and less revenue to actually spend, and they didn't want to actually change their policies, and that's why you get into this never-ending spiral of the peso declining and the Argentine government intervening and actually trying to, set prices and restrict exports. One might say that the Argentina government being so heavy-handed with the agriculture industry, that might have been one of the things that tipped the scale towards Milei. A lot of the reporting beforehand saw you had Massa who was putting up signs in Argentine subways and things like that, talking about, well, here's prices under the old government, here's prices if Milei does what he wants to do. But if you talked to farmers or listened to the quotes of farmers in all of these different articles, they would talk about how the previous government was terrible to them and they were sick of it and tired of it and wanted to compete on a global level the way that they knew that they could, because Argentina is one of the most prolific agricultural countries in the world. There's no reason that Brazil should be becoming an agricultural superpower and Argentina should be left behind, even with the weather concerns that they've had over the last couple of years. All of which is to say, even if it was Massa, you might have been getting into a cycle of a couple of good years here for Argentina. They have been starved for capital for the last couple of years, and they look like they're entering a phase where they're going to have plenty of capital, where they're going to be selling their agricultural goods, they're going to be selling energy, they're maybe even going to be selling lithium or any other of their precious mineral commodities. And that's even before we get into their strategic location and the things that they can negotiate with their strategic location in general. All of that should say, wow, so maybe this is the beginning of a real change. Maybe this politically, it's the early 1990s in Brazil, and Argentina has all these resources, and maybe we're finally going to go towards Argentina achieving its potential. That is the optimistic take. The realistic take, I think, is that for a century, Argentina has been defined by boom and bust cycles. So it has all of this wealth, it harnesses the wealth, it gets a period of growth. Everybody starts to believe in it. They think, oh, Argentina's finally turned the corner. And yet there is something in Argentine culture or the way that the Argentina government is structured. I don't know. If I had the answer, I wouldn't be grasping at straws here. And people have written entire books trying to get across to this riddle and can't quite get into it. But over and over and over again, what happens is you get those boom and bust cycles. So Argentina booms, the government spends money, it hands out more social services, it talks about how it needs to fix social justice, yada, yada, yada. Eventually, the commodity cycle goes down, Argentina's over levered, and everything happens in repeat, and history repeats itself. And I'm not sure that I have seen enough yet to say that I don't think history is going to repeat itself again. Now, at CI, we decided not to express a view one way or another when it came to Argentina. It was a little bit too risky for us. And also, there just are not a lot of good ways to express that thesis in public markets. Yes, you can go after a couple of Argentina energy companies like YPF. Yes, there's an Argentina ETF, although a lot of it is Mercado Libre, which is not really, are you really getting exposure to Argentina or not? I was joking that if you really had spare capital, go around and buy some vineyards, some Malbec vineyards or something like that, or some cattle farms or cattle ranches in Argentina and see what your dollars can get you. But in general, at CI, we didn't have an investment thesis here. And one of the reasons was we didn't see a lot of vehicles for investment there in the first place. And that could be the first place the Argentina government wants to make changes. Maybe it will realize that there is a story to tell here and that foreign investors, if they see even a little bit of stability, even a little bit of things that make them confident that Argentina can marshal these resources towards achieving its potential, I think you'd get a lot of interest in general, in the same way that Brazil has been able to do that over the last couple of years, or Mexico has been able to do that over the last couple of years. So there definitely is a path there. But in the investment side of our house, like I said, we haven't expressed that at all, and it's pretty difficult to express it at all. Maybe we will get there as we start to see what Milei does and how he governs and whether the system functions or whether it is just a bunch of chaos. But right now, in terms of money where our mouth is, our money is nowhere. Our money says there are actually other places in Latin America that look a lot more appetizing, hint Mexico, hint Brazil, where there aren't those sorts of risks and there is still a lot of upside and a lot of those geopolitical fundamentals that we like. None of those countries, though, can say that they have a president who was told to run for office because his dog told him so. Suddenly, any of Lula's idiosyncrasies and AMLO's idiosyncrasies, and both of them have them, all of their idiosyncrasies go away. Not since Bolsonaro have we had someone quite as strange as Milei, and honestly, Milei is a lot stranger than Bolsonaro is anyway. So the last point I guess I'll just make is This sucks for Argentines, who I think either way are going to be going through a period of immense change and immense volatility. But if you are watching what's happening in Argentina right now from outside, this should be very interesting. Break out the popcorn and let's watch this geopolitical experiment in action. The one thing that Argentina has going for it is that it has all the resources it needs. I often say there are very, very few countries in the world that geopolitically are not constrained by their resource bases or by the things that they actually have. Usually countries are fighting because they don't have food or they don't have energy or they don't have. Argentina has everything it needs if it wants to be a successful country. It just has not been able to get its politics to line up with its reality. And I think the one thing we can say for certain here as we walk away from this is that Argentines got fed up. They said enough is enough. We're tired of the system as it was before, and we are willing to vote for change, even if it is somebody who, by any objective standard, seems absolutely demented. So, with that, probably not a podcast this Friday between me and Rob, considering the Thanksgiving holiday and all. But if anything else crazy happens in the world, you can be sure that you will hear from me. Otherwise, if you are in the United States and celebrating Thanksgiving, have a great holiday. Enjoy yourselves. If you are not in the United States and want to celebrate Thanksgiving, do so. Eat some turkey, drink some bourbon, have a good time. Cheers and see you out there. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.